The honourable member for Davenport.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just want to let you know I will be splitting my time with my very fine and honourable colleague from Kingston and the Islands. So, Madam Speaker, it's an honour for me to once again rise in this honourable House and speak on behalf of the residents of my riding of Davenport on Bill C-77, which is an act to amend the National Defence Act and to make related and consequential amendments to other acts. And the focus of my comments over the next 10 minutes is going to be on discussing the importance of this bill and its implications for Indigenous peoples. Now, before I begin, Madam Speaker, I do want to say that repairing the relationship with Indigenous people and building a new nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous people of this country is very important to Davenport residents. They both want to see a renewed relationship, and they also want to see that we've made some key progress. And so that's why I'm very glad that I will be focusing on the implications for Indigenous peoples, and maybe just to sort of highlight two key things that this bill will do that specifically will benefit our Indigenous peoples of Canada. The first is that Bill C-77 includes Indigenous sentencing provisions which require military tribunals consider the circumstances of Indigenous offenders at sentencing, as is the case in civilian justice system. The other thing that it does is that through Bill C-77, we are ensuring that Indigenous people are given the same rights and respect in the military as in civilian courts. Now, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, Madam Speaker, so I'm just going to start at the beginning and provide a little bit of context. So each time that Canada has called upon its armed forces, Indigenous peoples have volunteered to proudly and honourably serve their country. Many have done so while facing discrimination and inequality from the very people they were sworn to defend and the very institution that they have chosen to serve. It is part of our history that we acknowledge, sadly, and it is a wrong that we seek to right each and every single day. As all members of the military, Indigenous service members make sacrifices to serve. They have left their homes, their families, and their communities to fight in war zones, and so that we may, as Canadians, enjoy peace and security here at home in Canada. They were valued allies in the War of 1812. Then came the First and Second World Wars, when thousands of Indigenous servicemen and men risked their lives for freedom, and they did so again in the Korean and Gulf Wars. And more recently, Indigenous Canadian Armed Force members have served in missions in Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, and other UN-led missions. And just to let you know, Madam Speaker, is I happened to be in Iqaluit, and I remember seeing a monument that actually was dedicated to those Indigenous Canadians who have died in service of this country in various wars in our past. And I also wanted to mention that there are countless members of the Rangers who work diligently to protect our sovereignty, perform search and rescue operations, and carry out operations and patrols. And I actually happened to have a chance to meet with a group of them when I arrived in Iqaluit over the summer via the Canadian Leaders at Sea program that basically had me sailing from the HMCS Charlottetown from St. John's, Newfoundland to Iqaluit, and it was really wonderful to meet the Rangers. It was wonderful to get a chance to understand the work that they do, to understand how well they work with our Canadian Armed Forces, and it was just a wonderful opportunity to get a chance to meet them. But Madam Speaker, I'm not here to give you a history lesson, but I am here to reaffirm the respect we have for our Indigenous Canadian Armed Forces members and how the legislation our government is proposing now reflects that respect. As our Prime Minister has stated before, no relationship is more important than our relationship with Indigenous peoples. Based on self-identification statistics from May 2017, Indigenous Canadians make up a total of 2.7% of our armed forces. This means that nearly 2,500 Indigenous members in total now serve in the regular and reserve forces. They are employed in careers throughout the Canadian Armed Forces and have become leaders in fields as diverse as engineering and physiotherapy to vehicle maintenance and system specialties. Suffice it to say that their contribution is notable, and Canadians owe these members a great debt of gratitude. Madam Speaker, our government has put an unprecedented focus on reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. We understand that for far too long, Indigenous peoples have had to prove their rights exist and have had to fight to have them recognized. This past November, our Prime Minister delivered a powerful and long overdue apology to residential school survivors in Newfoundland. But as the Prime Minister stated, saying sorry isn't enough. Saying sorry does not undo the harm that was done and does not bring back the culture that they lost. A real apology begins with action. And that's why we are taking steps for real and lasting change. So earlier this year, our Prime Minister stood in the House to discuss the recognition and implementation of a rights framework, and that was actually done in February of this year. And the importance of that is that we are taking a much more proactive stand, and in doing so, we are not only transforming the status quo of how Canada operates and interacts with Indigenous people, but is also challenging and supporting Indigenous communities themselves in a positive way to lead change, rebuild and find solutions, and take their rightful place within Confederation in ways that reflect Indigenous self-determination. So I'm very proud that we did that earlier this year, Madam Speaker. Our Prime Minister further stated that it is our job as a government to support, accompany, and partner with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. It is our responsibility to provide them the framework and tools they can use to chart a path forward. The framework will lay the foundation for real and lasting change. It is up to us to take concrete action towards a better future for Indigenous peoples. Actions like reducing the overrepresentation of Indigenous Canadians in federal prisons, which is about a quarter of all inmates in Canadian prisons are the Indigenous Canadians. And unfortunately, female incarceration rates are actually higher than men's at 38%. So something we really need to work on. And indeed, this is one of the priorities set out in the Minister of Justice mandate letter from the Prime Minister when she first was appointed. This speaks directly to the calls to action declared by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is called upon by our government to address the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in custody. While the military justice system hasn't experienced overrepresentation of Indigenous offenders, the proposed changes to the National Defence Act reflects our understanding that Indigenous Canadians have faced very difficult histories, and that they should be taken into account when determining which sentences would best serve justice in each particular case. The proposed amendments to the National Defence Act mirror the civil system's considerations for sentencing and our nation's history. As it currently stands, the National Defence Act does not mandate military tribunals to consider the specific circumstances of Indigenous Canadians when determining sentencing the way our civilian criminal justice system does. This legislation will change that, Madam Speaker, and will bring the military system more in line with our civilian criminal justice system. Canadian civil courts are mandated to consider the circumstances and history of Indigenous offenders when considering sentencing opinions. This information then informs the judge's decision about appropriate sentencing for the Indigenous offender. Bill C-77 will enshrine those same principles in the military justice system. The proposed legislation will expand on the principle that in all cases, a sentence should be the least severe sentence required to maintain the discipline, efficiency, and morale of the Canadian forces that is appropriate given the gravity of the offence committed and the responsibility of the offender. The legislation then goes a step further and mandates particular attention to the circumstances of Indigenous offenders when determining appropriate sentences for service offenders. The hope is that keeping Indigenous offenders out of civilian and service prisons and detention barracks when justice can be met through other punishments will allow for better outcomes, better rehabilitation, less recidivism, and a greater sense of justice within Canada and our military. Madam Speaker, amending the National Defence Act speaks directly to our government's effort to repair and renew our relationship with Indigenous people. And our National Defence Department is also committed to focus on building relations with local chiefs and engaging with local communities. And I know that there's a lot more work that needs to be done. There's a lot more work that needs to be done in our reconciliation efforts, but I know that this bill goes a long way along this path. And I'm confident that our government will continue to take this right path forward. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk today.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? L'honorable député de Trois-Rivières.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And thank you to my colleague for her speech. We can always wonder, however, how is it that this bill took so much time? We are largely favorable to the measures included, but why is it did not see the light of day? For me, a question that remains unanswered, and perhaps she could enlighten me. The acts of self-mutilation are always considered a crime under the military justice system. What measures of protection will the Liberals implement or put forward to ensure that soldiers have access to mental health services without being concerned about a reprimand or other disciplinary measures?
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for his excellent question. In terms of timing, I think we all wish things moved a lot faster in government. All I say is that I'm absolutely pleased that we finally have this before the House, that we are finally strengthening victim rights within the military justice system. And in terms of just this question around mental health and supports within this bill, what I will tell you is that this bill gives victims of service offenders clear statutory rights to information, to protection, to participation and restitution within the military justice system, and that it also provides a role it creates the role of a victim liaison officer that will help guide victims through the military justice system. And what are all the services and elements that will be available to a victim and at their disposal? Thank you so much, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I want to thank my colleague and neighbour in the Justice Building, and also a colleague on the Defence Committee. And I think with her, us on the Defence Committee are looking forward to having this bill get before us in relatively short order, so that we can go through the bill clause by clause. I want to just say that it's unfortunate that this bill is a copy of Bill C-77 under the Conservative government that was tabled just before the last election. It's taken 3 years to get it this far. I'm glad that we finally got it here, but we got to move on it when we get to committee. I was wondering if she would talk a little bit about, she was talking about the Victim Bill of Rights and how we are incorporating that, which is in the criminal code now, within the National Defence Act to ensure that the victims of crime in the military system will have the same rights and abilities, and then the importance of the right of information for those victims. And unfortunately, Corrections Service Canada broke the Victim Bill of Rights when they transferred Terry Lynn McClintock, the murderer of Tori Stafford, into a healing lodge. And that information should have been shared with the family of Tori Stafford and Rodney Stafford in particular, her father. So I wonder if you would talk about how we remedy that within Corrections Canada, since we are now bringing the rights for the victim into the National Defence Act and Bill C-77.
The honourable member for Davenport.
Thank you so much, Madam Speaker. So there's a couple of comments that the honourable member made, and I'd like to respond to. The first is, indeed, my understanding is that there was a similar bill that was introduced under the former Harper Conservative government, but it was actually introduced in the dying days of that government. And so I wonder whether there was any intention to actually pass that legislation. I do want to say that we have made sure that this legislation was introduced in more than enough time for us to be able to see this bill through the legislative process. And so I'm very, very proud that we, through this bill, will be strengthening victim rights within the military justice system. In terms of some of the additional comments that you've made, I think that there is, as part of this bill, the Declaration of Victims' Rights. It will ensure that victims who come forward to report harassment and misconduct will have the supports that they need. It very much builds on Bill C-65, which is our commitment to create workplaces free from harassment and discrimination from the federal sphere. And as I mentioned earlier, for those that are looking for specific services, victims looking for specific services, it does create the role of a victim liaison officer that will help guide them through the military justice system and what's available to help them.